Good afternoon, students. I'm about to give you my last video for the Odyssey. You'll have to overlook my appearance because of the times. I haven't had an opportunity to get my hair, what little I have cut. So forgive me a little bit, but maybe my presentation isn't all that bad. At any rate, I think you should be grateful in terms of what I'm doing in teaching the Odyssey for you. I really want you to do well on the next exam. And remember, that exam will be, I will send it out over the weekend, and it's due Monday by 12 o'clock, meaning 12 midnight. Now, it's very important that you cooperate with me and make sure that I get it, because we have to finish, in a sense, next week. And then I'll talk to you then about the final. From my last video, I told you that you should go ahead and finish the Odyssey and that you would start reading Hamlet. I probably won't give you as detailed a discussion on Hamlet, but I will provide you some insights. So the exam that's coming up for Monday over the Odyssey will be an important grade, and you really must put forth an effort to make sure that I get the paper. Now, we're not using Blackboard. What you're going to do is to submit it to me in a formal Word document. Once you get the exam, the instructions will be attached. So I think it's very important that you watch this video for that reason and for other reasons. I will be kind and tell you right now that there is no objective question on this exam. It's divided into two parts. There will be a kind of identification question. I'll give you a character, a term, a situation, and you write several sentences explaining the significance of. If it's a term, then define that term and see if you can cite an example from the Odyssey. I'm not going to give a formal question on quotations, so it will be the identification question, and then there will be several essay questions. You need to answer all parts of the exam. So I don't think we're going to have the problem that we may have encountered over the Iliad. There won't be really a time restraint. I ask you not to wait until the last minute and turn these in at 10 minutes of 12. You'll have the benefit of the weekend for the most part, and then certainly Monday. Now remember, if you were doing it in a class situation, you'd only have that period. So once again, I'm showing you, I think, a kind of courtesy by letting you have this several days in advance. So I do expect a good job. Details will be important. Now, what I want to do today is to finish portions of the last section of the Odyssey. Now, I'm going to go ahead and use the prose translation. Some of you may have it, but some of you may not have it. But I also have to take into account that if you're using the anthology, once again, they go into a kind of an abridgment of the Odyssey. In other words, they're going to omit some of the chapters in this third section. I understand that, and I will take that into account. But there will be one portion that I will call your attention to. You don't necessarily have to go and reread anything. So what I'm doing, your advantage will be if you have the prose translation. But if you don't have the prose translation and you're using the edition in our anthology, you're going to be perfectly fine. By the time I conclude this video, you will have all of the information that you need in preparation for this exam. So I make a comment about chapter 13, and technically, if you were reading the entire Odyssey, the third section comprises chapters 13 through 24. But I'm going to pick out the selected chapters that are in your anthology. Now, just as a moment of review from the last video, as we finished Book 12, we concluded the adventure section. This section begins, if you're remembering the rites that Odysseus must participate in before he's allowed to get home, he's participating now in what is called the rite of incorporation. I explained this to you a bit last time near the end of that video, but I'll repeat some of it again in case you may have forgotten. Now, he's returning, Nostos, to his place of origin, and this is going to be a good opportunity for him to recover his humanity. Now, here he's got to come back home and deal with all of the concerns and all of the problems confronting Ithaca. He is the only one who can address the wrongs that have been committed by the suitors. Now, his disguise is important. Remember, he doesn't come back bouncing in like the traditional epic hero. I reference the arrival of Agamemnon. The sections, and I can see why the anthology might have omitted certain chapters because this third section is rather long, but one of the reasons I offer as an explanation is I told you a couple of things must happen. Odysseus is going to need an opportunity to undergo a series of physical recognitions. In other words, he's got to be received back into this society that he has left. Remember, 20 years have elapsed. And also, I told you, part of the rite of incorporation is he's got to perform some feat or task. In other words, the people in Ithaca need his expertise here. So we want to see that in this third section, he has changed as a character by having gained experience from the adventures. So one thing I want to call your attention to, by the end of book 24, Odysseus very shortly will become king of Ithaca. His father, Laertes, is simply holding on for the day that Odysseus can return home so that he can assume the responsibilities of being king. Now, some question and say, how will Odysseus be as a king? He's going to be an excellent king. He's had very good schooling. Remember his whole stay with the Phaeacians. Alcinous has been a model example of what a good king, in other words, what the qualities invested in a good king. And Odysseus has had an opportunity to be skilled and to gain skill, I should say, and to be schooled by Alcinous. So once he assumes the responsibility, he will show that he's most able. Now, one thing I call your attention to, if you were looking at chapter 13, there's going to be a moment, and this is in good preparation for your exam on Monday. I do want you to pay attention to Homer's treatment of women in the Odyssey, and I think there are several. Two very important women, obviously, are going to be Athena, and then you're going to have to pay some attention to Odysseus' wife, Penelope. You saw how she behaved in the first 4 chapters, if you read the first 4 chapters, even if you just simply read the chapters provided in the anthology. Now, I'm going to read this to you. You won't find this portion in the anthology, but I'm going to make a point, and then a little bit later, it'll come to pass in terms of one of the chapters in your anthology. It says, the two of them sat down by the trunk of the sacred olive tree to scheme the downfall of the presumptuous suitors. Now, you all remember that the suitors have violated hospitality, and they have taken over the kingdom of Ithaca. It is up to Odysseus to restore religious, political, and social order. Now, the gods have a new design and a new purpose for Odysseus. He's no longer going to be the traditional epic hero. The gods want him to be a ruler. They want him to be king. And as king, one of his important duties will be to be an administrator of justice. He must enact justice in terms of the Ithacan society. So it reads, the bright-eyed goddess was the first to speak. Odysseus, favorite of Zeus, son of Laertes, master of ingenuity, consider now how you will come to grips with these shameless suitors who for 3 whole years have been lording it in your palace, paying court to your incomparable wife and offering her marriage gifts. All this time she has pined for your homecoming, and though she has given them all some grounds for hope and made promises in her private messages to each, her real wishes are very different. She has remained loyal to Odysseus. Now, part of this notion, when he comes back home, he's got to show and demonstrate the ability that he can reform, recreate, make Ithaca into a better society than it was. Now, I'll pick up as I flip through. We will go to chapter 16, because chapter 16 is the next chapter in the anthology. If you have the prose translation, you can glance through these chapters in between 13 and 16 and glance over them. But in the anthology, if you're using the anthology, what I want you to do is to read the summary before you get to chapter 16. Now, here, part of if I'm trying to get across to you that Odysseus must undergo a series of physical recognitions, this is one of the ways that he will be accepted back into Ithacan society. There are going to be several, and you probably have noted these as you have read the 3rd section. One I call your attention to, and now I think you will be able to get the line reference. I'm in chapter 16, about line 190. The idea is that you've got to have the reunion between, even though if I'm trying to get across to you, that what he's got to do is to establish social order, and our domestic order, so as to speak. What he's got to do is to establish relationships, all right? One relationship will be, he's got to be reunited with his son. Now remember what has happened to Telemachus. So I'll start reading just a little bit. I'm in chapter 16, about line 190. With that he kissed his son, and the tears ran down his cheeks to the ground. But Telemachus would not yet accept that it was his father. You're not my father. You're not Odysseus. No mortal man could do such a thing by design. Now, as you continue, go to about line 205. Notice what Odysseus says. Be quiet. Certain of this, no second Odysseus will return. No, I am the man, just as you see me, back in my own country, in the, remember now, 20th year of misfortune and wandering. Remember, there you take into account the 10 years. As for these changes in me, they are the work of the warrior goddess Athena, who can do anything and make me look as she wishes. But I have to be honest with you and tell you for all purposes that obviously Odysseus has undergone certainly a kind of physical change. Now, he's not your young, snapping, epic hero. He's aged, all right? Remember, 20 years elapsed. So, for all purposes, what I want you to see is, in establishing this relationship between him and Telemachus, the idea of continuity is achieved here. See, This is all going to be part of Odysseus' legacy. You remember, he wants to establish his claim, not only as a kind of epic hero, but what he wants to do too is to establish his claim as a good king and ruler. And then look, one day the throne will pass on to Telemachus, who will pick up the reign of ruling Ithaca. So the idea is Odysseus is pleased with what has happened to his son. Remember the journey that Telemachus has undertaken. So Telemachus will be a suited person to take over once Odysseus relinquishes power. Do you remember what the prophet Tiresias had said in book 11 about Odysseus? You remember, he's going to live now a long life, and he's not going to die as this epic hero on the battlefield. Now, that's the purpose, if you will, of chapter 16. And as I flip pages, I call your attention to the last paragraph, which will be about line 480. It says, they had now finished preparing the meal, so they sat down and thoroughly enjoyed their supper together. Reunion. When their thirst and hunger were satisfied, they thought of their beds and accepted the gift of sleep. You remember, sleep is a motif, just as bath has been a motif. And I said for all purposes that, you remember, in the adventures, sleep at times proved to be a kind of destructive element. In this section, it's the opposite. It's going to be that moment whereby he will be restored to health and strength. Now, you can look a little bit in terms of chapter 17, but as I'm going through, I simply want to call your attention to one, I think, very humbling, one very sobering moment. My reference to you is chapter 17, about line 290. This has a kind of personal feeling for me. As they stood talking, a dog lying there lifted his head and pricked up his ears. Argus was his name. And now, read into that. I'll pick up a little bit down, about line 295. But now, in his owner's absence, he lay abandoned on the heaps of dung from the mules and cattle which lay in profusion at the gate, awaiting removal by Odysseus' servant as manure for his great estate. Now, but directly he became aware of Odysseus' presence, he wagged his tail, dropped his ears, though he lacked the strength now to come nearer to his master. Odysseus turned his eyes away, and making sure Eumaeus did not notice, brushed away a tear and said, this is another example of acceptance, of physical recognition. Can you imagine that moment? This poor dog has remained so very loyal, so very steadfast for Odysseus. Now, you remember part of when I explained this idea of disguise, this is not the time for Odysseus to be recognized. Can you imagine how hard it would be for him to hold back and not acknowledge this beautiful creation, this beautiful dog? And when I said it was a bit personal to me, when I got my first, well, actually it's been about 18 years, I was given by members of a fraternity that I was advising. I'd made the comment, I said if I ever had a dog, I would name him Argus after this moment. They bought one for me, except it wasn't a he, it was a she. And she was such an important part of my life, just as those of you who have that kinship. So I think this is a great moment of recognition. See, look at Odysseus. It shows his sensitivity, if you will, as a character. Now, there's nothing else I'm going to call your attention to except if you will go into chapter 17, about line 460, along in there. Now, Odysseus, if I'm trying to get across to you that he very much has changed as a character, if you'll read from about line 460 to about line 480, and as I said, I don't need to take the time right now and read all of this to you, but just look in terms of what you're seeing from about line 460, 480, along in there. Odysseus wants to make sure, he's got to find this answer out himself, that these suitors really have committed this wrong. The idea is that they really did violate hospitality. And as you read here, notice their behavior. Notice in disguise how they're going to treat Odysseus. So see, if he's going to be a fair administrator of justice, he wants to gather evidence and make sure that these suitors deserve the punishment that will be meted out to them. Now, I have to overlook, if you will, chapter 18. It's not in the anthology. And what I have to do is go now to chapter 19. And you have a great moment in chapter 19, another very important moment, if you will, of recognition. So I'm now in chapter 19, about line 390. I say for all purposes here, if you'll start reading the passage where in my text it begins, the old woman fetched the gleaming basin, which she always used for washing the feet of guests. You see, there's your idea of hospitality. Now read there, and notice what happens. Odysseus was sitting by the fire, but now he swung abruptly round to face the dart, for it had struck him suddenly that in touching him she might notice a certain scar he had, and his secret would be out. See, for all purposes, the old maid, Euryclea, the servant, is a confidant. You remember her behavior in part 1 of the Odyssey? All right, it says at once she recognized the scar, and it tells you how Odysseus came about this scar. Look, the scar is a symbol of identity. I would imagine we all have a kind of physical scar, and I bet all of you out there can recall the circumstances under which you gain that scar. And this is going to make this work even a bit more human. I think an excellent recognition, but notice she too will be quiet. So see, what I'm trying to do right now, as I had begun my comments to you, Odysseus is fitting back more and more into Ithacan society. All right, she, the nurse, is very much a figure of loyalty, devotion, and stability. She maintains the respect, the loyalty of the family that she serves. So I thought that a good moment. Now, I'm overlooking chapter 20, and I will go instead to chapter 22. And it is at this moment, this is going to be a kind of turning point in the Odyssey. Scholars really liked the way that Homer sets up his plot line. Scholars have said that this is a good opportunity to show good and bad. And the idea is, part of what I want to show you in terms of the suitors, if you think about the two works that we have read, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the suitors represent the opposite of any kind of heroic qualities. Now, you might say for all purposes that momentarily Nobody wants to see someone die, but the suitors do deserve what's going to happen to them. And their demise, once again, I've been emphasizing to you the importance. You don't go out and blame the gods for what has happened. Man makes these decisions. The suitors chose to do what they did. Now, very carefully what Odysseus has done. See, this is one of the reasons why it's going to take as long as it does in terms of if you were reading from chapter 13 to 24. There's that moment when he feels that all of the suitors have not really been that bad. There's some out there who are, fairly good or who are somewhat decent, and he has warned them to leave. Now, that's their decision. If they want to heed his advice, they can do so. If they don't, then they have to bear the responsibility. They have to bear the consequence for their actions as well as their decision. So I think a very important moment is about line 35. I'm in chapter 22. It says, the master strategist, Odysseus, gave them a black look. You dogs, he cried, you never thought to see me back from Troy. So you fleeced my household, you raped my maids, you courted my wife behind my back, though I was alive, with no more fear of the gods in heaven than of the human vengeance that might come. One and all, your fate is sealed. He's seeking justice. All right? Now, the idea is, if you get to Hamlet, you're going to have a similar theme, and the theme here may be a kind of revenge. Some acquaint revenge with this idea of justice. So the idea is that with the aid of Telemachus and others, he will kill the suitors. Now, as you come to a conclusion in terms of chapter 22, this is most important. I'm in chapter 22 still, about line 395. I would read to you, and it says, Telemachus obediently went off, rattled the door of the women's quarters, and called out Euryclea, get up, old woman, and come here. And then read into this, and what she's done, or what Telemachus is telling her, is to come and see Odysseus. Now, this is really a most important moment. About line 400, it says, she found Odysseus among the corpses of the dead, spattered with blood and gored. What a good simile you're about to see here. Like a lion, when he comes from feeding on some foremost bullock, with the blood dripping from his breast and jaws on either side. A fearsome spectacle. That was how Odysseus looked, with the gore spattered on his legs and arms. But when Euryclea saw the dead men and the sea of blood, she felt like crying out in triumph at the mighty achievement that confronted her. See, that's that feeling of devotion, loyalty. The idea is she's acknowledging what these suitors had done. All right, now note this line. Odysseus, however, checked her exuberance with a sharp rebuke. This is great. Restrain yourself, old woman, and gloat in silence. I'll have no cries of triumph here. It is an impious thing to exult over the slain. These men fell victims to the will of the gods and their own infamy. In other words, they brought this on themselves. They paid respect to no one on earth who came near them, good or bad. Now their own transgressions have brought them, and the idea is this ignominious death. Now this is so very important. Notice when we had begun really the first adventure in the second section what Odysseus had done on his way home. You remember he took pride in being the sacker of cities. Part of what he has learned here is the value of life. Life is important. Now, see, he's acknowledging it's a sorry thing what he did, but it had to be done. And what he did, he has accepted the will of the gods. The gods, listen, the gods sanctioned what he had to do. Look, he's not proud of it, but there is a justification, don't you see, for it. So I think that's very important. Now, some say, well, don't you fault the nurse? No, I don't fault the nurse at all. She's acting in accord with the way she must feel. Now, if you'll go to chapter 23, a very important moment will come in chapter 23. Once again, I'm trying to get across to you an important physical recognition for Odysseus is to be received back into fold by his wife. In other words, if I'm trying to tell you that he's got to restore order, once again, I emphasize this business of domestic social order. Now, probably if you look at Penelope just a little bit, she may have a tinge of resentment toward Odysseus. Look at the insight that you have. You know what Odysseus has done in the adventure section. And remember, she remained back home in Ithaca. Now, I'm not going to say, I don't know what she did one lonely night. Homer doesn't tell us. Maybe she's been steadfast in her loyalty. I would like to think so. I think she's... Listen, the two complete each other as characters. As I think they're most suited as mates. You remember how Odysseus, if I'm telling you that he's mastered the art of deception, meaning useful deception, so has Penelope. You remember that whole business in the first section about dealing with the suitors? You remember how she made the promise and said that she would marry one of them once she finished the weaving of the funeral shroud. All right, but you wonder what she would do. She'd go back to her room at night and undo the weaving that she had done the day before. So it was a delay tactic. Now, what it amounts to here is if Odysseus, he can't just come back home and say, hey, I'm your husband, take me back. You have that very, very fine moment where you have the bid test. You remember how she's going to test him? Look, I'm about in your text, about line 175. Look what she says. Come, Euclea, move the great bed outside the bedroom that he himself had built. Now, you all know the circumstances of the bed, and the test for Odysseus is if he weren't really Odysseus, he wouldn't say what you're reading in the next paragraph. This was her way of putting her husband to the test. And notice what Odysseus is how he's going to react to it. The bed cannot be moved because one of the bedposts is an olive tree, so it can't be moved. So I think she's been a delightful character. She's maintained this kind of self-control here. She's been very patient. Very diligent. She's waited. And you have the reunion between husband and wife. So, the feud is ended as you go to chapter 24. I've already told you for all purposes that the gods are pleased. Now, what I want you to do is go to chapter 24 and go to about line 330. And as you deal with line 330, Odysseus has got to see his father. That is another moment of physical recognition. All right? So I would like for you to read about 330, line 330 in chapter 24. It says, Laertes answered him, If you who have come here really are my son Odysseus, home again, give me some definite proof to convince me. That's good. Remember what Penelope had done in terms of the bed. All right, now, this is good. But look what Odysseus is going to have to do. He says, I'm about line 335. Then again I can tell you all the trees you gave me one day on this terraced garden. I was only a little boy at the time, trotting after you through the orchard, asking about this and that. And as we wound our way through these very trees, you told me their names. You gave me 13 pear trees, 10 apple trees, and 40 fig trees, each ripened at a different time, so that the bunches on them were at various stages of ripeness as the seasons of Zeus weighed down their branches. Won't you contrast this moment to what you read about the Phaeacians? Look, this whole business of when I had been talking to you about the utopian experience, all right, you don't go out and say, through your travels and say, well, gosh, I found this utopia. Look what Odysseus is going to do. By identifying the trees and so forth, he gains this ancestral possession of his future. That word kilos comes to mind here. All right, he has re-established his identity. And the idea is, what he can do now is, don't go out and search for some kind of utopia. Create it. Restore it. And this is what he's going to do. See? In other words, like the Phaeacians, put forth the work ethic and make it happen. Right now, I think we're ready, in a sense, to conclude. So I will go to the last of the Odyssey, meaning the last page, and this is going to be about line 335. Now, and then we'll draw conclusions. What I want to get across to you is there's going to be a similarity between Odysseus and Achilles. Remember I told you that in the Iliad, Priam, by his actions and his behavior, will make a human being out of Achilles. What's going to happen here is that Odysseus is going to be made into a human being. And look what he becomes now, to me, a very complete character. All right, he's going to experience those moments of joy. He's going to experience those moments of sadness. That's part of the idea of being complete. And he really has this opportunity to establish Ithaca and make Ithaca into a better place than it was. Now you understand that some of the relations, some of the relatives, if you will, of the suitors want to start this whole business over again. So I want to call your attention to about line 338, 340. Look what's going to happen. But at this moment Zeus flung a flaming thunderbolt, which fell in front of the bright-eyed daughter of that formidable sire. Athena called out to Odysseus, Odysseus, favorite of Zeus, resourceful man, son of Laertes, hold your hand, stop fighting your countrymen, in case you incur the wrath of Zeus the Thunderer. That's enough. No more. It's over. Now, this is a kind of what I call a dramatic moment in the work. See, if I'm going to sit here and tell you that Odysseus is going to restore order, we've got to have this moment of closure. We've got to stop things. All right? Otherwise, all that I've been explaining to you, I hope it hasn't been in vain. All right. The gods sanctioned what Odysseus has had to do. So notice the last passage. It says, Odysseus obeyed her, and his heart rejoiced. Then Pallas Athena, still using Mentor's form and voice from her disguise, established peace between the two sides. See? Now, what the work is going to do is to, in a sense, re-establish, reaffirm Odysseus as a man, as a human being, who now will become even more of a productive member of his society. So I think very clearly that order is restored in the Odyssey. Remember the plot formation as I had explained it when we looked at the Iliad? The idea is order is disrupted, and part of the task of the hero is that he must restore order. I have no problem seeing that order has been restored on our three levels. Now remember these. Religious order. The suitors violated hospitality. All right. They went against the will of the gods. All right. Odysseus had to punish them because they did disrupt this level. And then political order. Now, once Odysseus will assume the throne, remember that Telemachus is too young, Laertes is too old. The time is for Odysseus to pick up the reins and rule. Now, the test for him will be to see if he can put all of this experience that he has gained in his adventures to good use, particularly, as I said earlier, what he has learned from his stay with the Phaeacians. He has been taught well. And then clearly you see that social and domestic order achieved. Look how you have a reconciliation between father, son, Telemachus, Odysseus, husband, wife, and then Odysseus, son, and father. Clearly order is restored. So I conclude by letting you know that the Odyssey very, very much ends on a kind of human note. Humanity is achieved. Now I can close. Very soon I will go in and post this video. But all of you remember now, you have more than enough time to prepare for your examination over the Odyssey. I want you to do a very, very good job, and this will be an important part of our getting through this difficult semester. So I still hope all of you are doing well, and look for the exam to be posted over the weekend, and please follow my instructions. Have a good afternoon.